Hi guys, in this video we're going to look into Maya animation fundamentals. First of all, I'm going to be in Maya Classic mode up here. Now you can use animation mode. I'm not too fond of this mode. It adds some extra windows that we maybe don't really need. So I'm going to just work in Maya Classic mode. So down the bottom here, we've not mentioned much about this, but this is our timeline. So if I left click and drag along it, I will move forwards in time. Okay, so I'm now here, I'm on frame 6. You can see it has this little grey circle here. I can then move forward to frame 10. Okay, these little red lines, these are keyframes. We'll talk a little bit more about these in a second. Over here I've got my play tool, so if I click play, it's now going to play forwards, and it's just going to loop around the timeline here. If I press the other one, it's going to play backwards. Okay, super. We can also set a keyframe by pressing S. So I just press S on my keyboard here. So if I click this here, press S, it has now set that keyframe there. So I've now set a keyframe. I haven't done any animation yet. We'll look at that in a second. But this little tool here, this is going to jump to the next keyframe. So it's going to jump between those keyframes. If I just put one in the middle here, you can see it's going to hop between those frames there. This next button here is just going to step forward one frame. Okay, this is going to step forward to the end, this is going to step to the beginning here. So those are our main tools there. Down here is our frame range. So at the moment we have our animation starting at 0 and ending at 49. Okay, so this is actually the viewer that I'm seeing here. So I can click and drag on this here and it actually increases it. So now my frames go up to 160. So this number here, this is my maximum number of frames in my animation. So at the moment I've got 300. If I put this to 200, it's going to shrink this down a little bit. So now my maximum range that I can have is 200. So I could put this to 100. I could then put this number to 50, and now I'm just viewing a smaller range. You can see my timelines are changing here, so I can view these smaller amounts of frames. So I can go into the negatives as well. So I could put -10 on here, and I could drag this and now look into -10. So this is my full range here. Down the bottom, we have FPS. So FPS means frames per second, and this means however many frames in between your keyframes, that's how long it's going to be. So 24 frames per second, if every 24 frames, that's 1 second. So the next 24 frames, that's another second. Okay, so we can change this to whatever we need, really. And there's a few common ones that we're going to use. We're mostly going to be working to 24 frames per second. This is animation for film. So all your Pixar movies you see, they will be animated to 24 frames per second. Now games, on the other hand, are 30 frames a second. Okay, so we would use 30 frames per second to animate. This would then be doubled to get up to 60 frames per second. So the way we animate between 30 and 60 would make no difference. If you want to use 60, you can do. You've got a few more kind of frames to play with, but we can do all of the same stuff with 30 because it is double that there. But as a general rule of thumb, we are going to stick to 24 frames per second. If we are working on our games, we are then going to change it down here to 30 frames per second. Okay, so now let's have a look at how we properly set these keyframes. So if I hold shift and left click and drag on the timeline, I can create a selection here. I can then right click and I can copy these keys, I can paste keys, I can delete keys, I can snap keys. I am going to delete these keys here, and we're going to look at how we can actually make keys on this object. So if I now click on this control rig here and go to my rotate tool, I'm actually going to select all of these here and make sure that all of them are selected. Let's delete those. Okay. So I can now move forwards and I can rotate these. So I've selected multiple there by shift clicking, so I am rotating all of these. I can now press S. Now we can see that my pendulum is going to move in between those two keyframes kind of automatically. I can hold shift and click this. So if I hold shift and left click around, what I've got here is I've got these little movement tools, so I can move this here. I've now moved this to 24 frames a second. So now if I just set this range to 0, if I press play, that has taken 1 full second to make that swing here. Okay, so pressing S on your keyboard will set a keyframe. Now bear in mind, objects have their own timelines. So if I move forwards now to 48 and rotate this and set a keyframe on this, you'll notice that it's just this part that's moving, okay? And I've got my keyframe there. If I now click on another one of these controls here, you'll notice that keyframe isn't there. Each one of these has its own sort of timeline. Now there are some ways around this, so if I just delete this keyframe here, and look here, my character set, I can click down on this. Okay, so I can click on the character set and I can change it to the pendulum character set. In the future, I'll show you how to create these. But what a character set does is it essentially groups all of these items together. So if I now select all of these here and I do a rotation on these, okay, and then I just have one selected now and I press S to set that keyframe, you'll notice that everything animates here. Okay, so that character set has now added a keyframe onto everything, and we can have a look at that by turning it off and clicking on all of these. We can see that there's a keyframe on all of those there. Okay, you can also do this by selecting all of them. So if I've now got all three of these selected, so if I hit S here, it's going to set a keyframe on all three of those. Okay, if you do the same again, so if I go to the other side, but I only have one selected and I set a keyframe, what's going to happen here is it's only going to be that one. So you saw it snap back there. It's only one thing that animates over there now. Okay. So last thing we're going to look at in this video is I am going to shift select everything, and I showed you how you can use these little middle arrows to move keyframes around fairly simply there. Okay, the arrows that are on the end here, these are scale ones. So if I grab these, I can scale it down. So I'm shrinking the whole animation. So I'm making it faster. Okay, so if I hit play, this animation is now going to play a lot faster, except I've made an issue. I've only done that on one of those. So I want to make sure I've got my character set on. I want to select everything. So we can see the speed this is moving now, it's 1 per second. Okay, so if I now select everything and I drag this together, it's now going to move a lot quicker. Oops. So you can see it moves really fast there. Okay. One last little thing you might want to check as well is if you right click on the timeline, we have different playback speed here. Okay, mine's set to real time at the moment, which is real time. But if it's maybe set to something different, you might get a different playback speed. So if I hit play here, okay, this looks relatively fine. Playback speed here, play every frame, max real time. Okay, so sometimes it makes it look really fast. It's not really changing much on mine at the moment, but you want to make sure your playback speed is set to real time there. So now if I hit play, it will be real time. Okay, now when we do scale keyframes down, we may notice that this frame here, I've snapped to this frame, it's 44.75. It's on not a real keyframe. So to fix that, we can sort of highlight everything, right click and snap. And what this is going to do is now it means that all the keyframes are on real frames rather than what I had before. If I just Control Z that, 11.18, 22.37, okay, we can see the problems that we're having here. So if we just highlight everything, right click and snap. Okay, so these are the fundamental tools of animation that you can use. It covers setup. We have looked at how we set keyframes. We've looked at how we drag. We looked at how we move keyframes around, how we scale keyframes, how we then snap them, how every object will have its own timeline. And this is so you can animate things independently of each other. Okay, thank you very much, guys.